Let's talk about how the World Economic Forum are waging war on our farmers, shall we? Hot off the heels of pestilence and war, the third horseman, famine, is riding in right behind them. But before we discuss that, let's discuss just a plug for an article on our website. If you'd like to subscribe to lotuseaters.com, you'll have access to this. My deep think on why the WEF's ESG system, the environmental, social and government scores, which are ruining things like energy businesses and things like that, and sabotaging the get woke, go broke dictum of markets, are basically equivalent to a biblical system of having a mark on your skin so you can work and trade. And I think at this point, calling the World Economic Forum satanic is kind of an understatement. So first, The Guardian's resident eco-communist himself, George Monbiot. George Monbiot is a very intelligent solution to why there are agricultural emissions. Let's listen to this brief clip, shall we?
This country, George, there's a big emphasis on agriculture and how agriculture needs to cut its emissions. And I know it's an issue you feel very strongly about. You've said that agriculture is arguably the most destructive industry on earth. Explain, and do you still believe that, George?
It's by far and away the greatest cause of habitat destruction, the greatest cause of wildlife loss, the greatest cause of extinction, greatest cause of soil loss, greatest cause of freshwater use. It's one of the greatest causes of climate breakdown, bigger than transport, one of the primary causes of water pollution and of air pollution. So it's right at the top. Oh, and sorry, I forgot to say land use, the biggest issue of all. It's by far and away the greatest form of land use that humans inflict on the planet, which means all that land is land which can't be used for wild ecosystems. And while obviously we need farming, we need to minimize those impacts. We need to act as drastically within that sector as any other sector to prevent the collapse of our life support systems. And what that means, above all else, is getting out of livestock farming, is really shutting down animal farming altogether, because that has massively disproportionate impacts on the living planet. And we need to switch towards other sources of food, plant-based diets, which are far more efficient, far lower environmental impacts, but also switch out of farming altogether to produce protein-rich foods, which we can do through precision fermentation, brewing
George,
microbes.
I can hear farmers all over this small country of ours shocked and perhaps screaming at their televisions because they're saying, are you saying all animal farming, in your opinion, really needs to stop?
Yes, it does. It really does. It's a bit like leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Unless we do that, we've really got very little chance indeed of preventing this domino effect of system collapse right across Earth systems, which basically makes the planet uninhabitable. So eating meat and milk and eggs is an indulgence we cannot afford.
So the last time that a misanthrope from England intervened in Ireland's agricultural policy, it didn't go too well. I specifically remember an absence of potatoes killed quite a few people, and I'm struggling to consider whether or not this large space between George's eyebrows is larger than the large space between his ears, because there's clearly nothing in that empty head of his. The unfortunate thing is that this kind of mindset has actually infected a lot of institutions and governments. So if we move over to the next article, this small change to farming could reduce agriculture's climate impact by 30%, our friends at the World Economic Forum. Agriculture accounts for 26% of all greenhouse emissions. Tractor fuel, fertilizer and methane from cattle are some of the main contributing factors. Tilling soil by breaking it up with ploughs exposes carbon buried in the soil. So they propose something called no-till farming. So that doesn't disturb the soil and instead involves planting seeds in drilled holes in the earth. This could slash greenhouse emissions and crop production by nearly a third and increase how much carbon soils can store. So this to me sounds a lot like, if we go to the next one, we're not going to read much from here, but Lysenkoism. I don't know if you're familiar with that term.
No.
So a Soviet biologist named Lysenko, funnily enough, proposed the idea that seeds have class consciousness and that if you plant them in shallow plots all together, because they were from the same species, they wouldn't compete for sunlight. And of course, when they did that and the crop harvests happened in Pol Pot's Cambodia, in Soviet Russia, and obviously Soviet-occupied Ukraine, and in Mao's China, massive famines across the board because it's stupid, but it sounds like screwing with farming will lead to more famines. So then let's look at more anti-farming policies in action, shall we? The Netherlands. So here was 2 years ago. How the World Economic Forum is telling farmers in the Netherlands to grow less food using less resources. So why don't we cut to now, 2 years after, shall we? The worldwide working class counter-revolution. So your policies from Davos clearly went well, didn't they? Demonstrations have been going on and off since 2019 when the Dutch legislature proposed a crackdown on nitrogen emissions. Nitrogen is heavily emitted by livestock and fertiliser, which means regulations are hitting Dutch agriculture especially hard. July 2022 is when the protests really took off and gained media steam. The Western European nation is the second largest food exporter on the earth, only after the United States, which is 237 times larger. In a sane world, this would be celebrated and copycatted. Michael Schellenberger actually points out that Dutch farms aren't using any more nitrogen fertilizer than they were back in the 1960s, so they've come leaps and bounds in terms of the innovation you were talking about earlier. But instead, the Dutch government have planned to sabotage this by, in compliance with a court order from the EU to cut nitrogen emissions by 50%, they're actually confiscating Dutch farmers' lands and culling livestock to reduce the amount of nitrogen emissions that are being leaked into their swamps. Because they're saying, oh God, the mosquito population's dropping and there's going to be more emissions. Quick, let's starve to death to save the planet. And now even Germany's farmers have crossed the border to join the Dutch. And then the French have actually protested the fertiliser bans back in 2021.
The Italian farmers are kicking off as well, I think.
I've heard there's a stirring there, and especially considering their government is in tumult right now, I wouldn't be surprised that something kicks off there as well. Then there's the next one that just says this is due to the World Economic Forum's dictums filtering through to the Dutch government, to the point of where the Dutch president denied that he'd ever read Klaus Schwab's book or knew who he was, but it turns out he'd sent a letter saying that it had a fantastic book. So clearly this unelected institution is influencing Dutch policy. The Dutch government have planned to reduce their nitrogen output by 95% by culling livestock herds and confiscating farmland, as I already said. So this whole protest movement has actually gained, in the next piece, some support from European politicians. So it turns out this sort of thing is working. We're pushing back against the unelected bureaucrats. On Thursday, farmers got local support, official support from the Polish government, which is trying to get Brussels to back down from its plans to cut emissions from the agricultural sector. Agriculture Minister Henry Kowalczyk, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, probably not.
I love this quote. You see angry farmers, the far right sees opportunity.
I know, it's always about the far right pounce on our totally terrible idea and the crisis that we've engineered. So
sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. No, never apologise. Kowalczyk of the ruling right-wing Law and Justice Party, what a terrible name. How could you be for law and justice rather than disorder and social justice? Met with Dutch farmers in Warsaw and endorsed their cause. I will support the EU in the EU the position of the Dutch farmers to maintain production, and I hope that their government will change its mind, Kowalczyk said. I'll be looking for allies among EU ministers. I have already found some for our position on stopping measures that could lead to a reduction in food production in the EU. This is a common, important task. Now, this would seem very sensible to rally against, I don't know, state-engineered famines. But this is being replicated around the world, and this phenomenon is not just happening in Europe, it's also happening in Asia. So if we look at Sri Lanka, for example, 4 years ago, this was an article written for the World Economic Forum by their former president. And I say former because he's been ousted by a revolution there. How I will make my country rich by 2025. So let's look at now as well as another party in the palace. Sri Lankans roam the president's compound, enjoying pillow fights, cricket, trying his private gym and swimming pool hours before the protesters torch the prime minister's house, and the president and PM say they will quit. So the revolution has been waged because they outlawed, in Sri Lanka, the use of fertiliser and decided to go for organic farming. And people said, well, this is expensive and I'm starving to death, so I'm just going to take to the streets. So a new president has actually been elected, but it turns out there's more protests for that as well. And the reason is, Sri Lanka's unpopular prime minister was elected president on Wednesday in a secret parliamentary ballot that risks reigniting turmoil among the public outraged by the economic collapse. 22 million people have been left struggling with shortages of essentials, including medicine, fuel, and food. Much of the protest's ire is focused on the new president and his family's political dynasty, which ruled Sri Lanka for the most of the past 2 decades. But they also blame the recent prime minister that was run out, protecting him and see him as part of the same problematic rule. The new guy was also the prior Prime Minister's finance minister and became acting president after he fled the country. He is, as we see in the next tab, a World Economic Forum contributor. So they've got one stooge out that wrote for the WEF and in with a new one. So it's unlikely the policies are going to change. And that's why we see now Sri Lanka has entered a state of emergency, so the policies aren't changing, they're just becoming more draconian. 2 activists who led mass demonstrations that toppled Sri Lanka's president have been arrested, and the parliament has extended tough emergency laws intended to impose order. Then acting president, I can't pronounce his name, it's Wickremesinghe. It's terrible, but I apologise, has declared a state of emergency on 17th of July. It allows the military to be given powers to detain people, limit public gatherings, and search private property. The emergency ordinance would have lapsed on Wednesday if it would not have been ratified by Parliament, which it was. So we see, on the flip side of the Dutch, the Sri Lankans are descending into more and more tyranny, and the famines do not seem to be being alleviated. So that's very concerning. So with these Tale of Two Cities, where will the rest of the West go? Well, in the most loyal of the World Economic Forum's penetrated cabinets, Justin Trudeau is seeking to implement a similar policy that was protested by the Dutch farmers in Canada. Seems like a sensible plan, doesn't it? In 2020, Trudeau's Liberals announced their goal was to reduce emissions from fertiliser by 50% over the next 8 years. In a report compiled by Myers Norris Penny, they suggest that the regulated fertiliser reduction could cost Canadian farmers $48 billion by 2030 and reduce crop sizes. The Toronto Sun reports fertiliser is the most expensive crop for farmers, and they tend to use only as much as needed. But under the plan, farmers will be likely to forced to use costlier, greener fertiliser, in turn translating to higher prices for consumers. So it's an inflationary pressure, as you spoke about in our prior segments, of less supply. And also, the farmers have got to internalise non-innovative utilities in producing the food in the first place. So from a production side and also from a diminished supply side, all the costs are going to shoot up. I see you basically putting your head in your hands because this should all be foreseen as not sensible, right?
Well, it's, there's a famous Milton Friedman quote that if the Saharan government was in charge of providing sand, there'd be
sand shortage.
Yeah, be sand shortage, whatever the quote is. And whenever government gets involved in any industry, it does not function as well. It gets way more expensive for its participants. And, the countries that have had great famines, every time is when government was in charge of producing food. And in the case of Ireland, which we mentioned before, it was because of stupid corn laws meant that they couldn't import grain because of the British were protecting their own landowning farmers. But you just see it here, and I keep coming back to my Mount Doom, when a government can afford to do all this because it has control of money. And, so you lobby the government and the government's like, yeah, well, we need to regulate this and that food. If the government cannot print money, it becomes suddenly much more limited in what it's able to do. And food would be one of those areas where people operating in the food industry would be left to get along with it. But because we've got this huge government overreach, its tentacles are in everything. And then you get these stupid ideologies that start wherever they start. And in this case, this is a WEF, Save the World Green ideology. And it just spreads through, and it just makes life very difficult for everyone.
This is the Mises knowledge problem, that you can't have one centralised state apparatus doling out things like prices at an accurate rate and setting them better than the market, because by the time the real-time supply side amount reaches shelves, the state's information is going to be out of date. And so the only people that suffer are the people that are trying to buy the goods when either they aren't there or they're 10 times the amount they expected. And that's why controlled economies never work. But that hasn't deterred Trudeau, for example, from clamping down on voices like ours in Canada, because he's unveiled a new censorship law that would remove hate from the internet. Bill C-36, an act to amend the criminal code, allows Trudeau to censor the press and social media with punitive measures such as house arrest or large fines of up to £70,000. And I think it's to preeminate another trucker protest by the farmers. I think it's so he can stop it before it even starts. They can't even organise.
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah. So what's with this war on nitrogen all of a sudden? Specifically fertilisers, isn't it? Now, it seems key to food production, but as we've already seen with the Dutch government, they're complaining about the consistency of their swamps, and why would we care about carbon sequestration when we can always develop carbon capture instead and still have our food? Well, the World Economic Forum have written continually about this. Nitrogen buildup is in the ocean, so they're complaining that nitrogen emissions are acidifying oceans and producing algae that's toxic to some plants and animals. It seems that we'd have a novel technological solution to that rather than starving ourselves. But there's also Scientific American who are complaining that protein in our diets is making our pee too laden with nitrogen, and so human consumption is killing the planet. Put down the burgers, eat the bugs, unless the world is going to burn. That's genuinely their line. Protein-packed diets add excess nitrogen to the environment through urine, rivaling pollution from agricultural fertilizers. I love how they say excess nitrogen, as if protein for me to eat is not vital to my continuation of my existence. Once it enters the environment, the nitrogen in urea can trigger a spectrum of ecological impacts known as the nitrogen cascade. Under certain chemical conditions, and in the presence of particular microbes, urea can break down to form gases of oxidized nitrogen. These gases can reach the atmosphere, where nitrous oxide can contribute via the greenhouse effect, and nitrogen oxides can cause acid rain. Remember the old acid rain line from the 80s and 90s? It never materialized that all our marble statues melted and our skin fell off. Well, they're bringing it out now. Isn't that brilliant? Researchers calculated the amount of nitrogen that would enter the environment if people ate today's American diet and if they instead reduced their protein intake to only what was nutritionally needed. That's very variable per person. This shift in diet alone could reduce the amount of nitrogen reaching aquatic ecosystems by 12% today and nearly 30% in the future, according to the study's results. Are you willing to?
No, they want to control what you eat.
Yeah, genuinely. That's it. Speaking of which, what will we eat in 2030 from the World Economic Forum? So what might we eat in 2030? I think demand will be shifting and more people will want to eat a healthy diet, one that is less intensive and wasteful of resources. The increasing emergence of localism, whole foods, organic, artisanal and real food movements are a sign of this, at least for the rich and dedicated. So the poor will just starve to death. So our diets may be more veg and fruit, whole grains and vegetarian food or new alternatives, soy products or perhaps insects and artificial meat. Genuinely, it's all come from here. And less fried and sugary things, which I actually endorse. We'll still eat meat, but perhaps more like our parents and grandparents see it as a treat to savour every few days. And that's why, if you remember the You Will Own Nothing and Be Happy video, item 4 was you will eat less meat. It wasn't a prediction, it was a threat. So they're pushing basically protein starvation under the guise of climate change. And if anyone is in doubt about the fact that this is controlled, as you said, they want to control what we eat. The founder of Kellogg's, for example, do you know he invented his cereals to reduce libido, to reduce the population?
I didn't know that.
I'm not making that up. Mr. Kellogg believed masturbation and sexual desires cause disease, and he was also a eugenicist, and he believed in breeding out disabilities and races. So these
he invented
people,
plain cereal to stop self-pleasuring.
yeah. So these crazy people, whether or not it's true, and it definitely isn't, these people genuinely believe this and are willing to inflict it on us. So it's never in doubt of whether or not there is a malicious intent behind making you eat the bugs. It's just, we just dispute that it works or not. And I don't want to do it, and it definitely won't save the planet, but it will make you miserable. And that seems to be the goal.
How is the World Economic Forum funded?
A bunch of hedge funds that come together. So they have something called their like new business leaders, and it's things like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. They all get together, and because they've got lots of shares in various companies, like if you look up any of the publicly traded companies, there's always BlackRock on there. Mm-hmm. They can set the tone, and they say, okay, rather than pursuing the shareholder model, we're going to shift to a stakeholder model, and that is social activism rather than corporate accountability. And we understand that's not profitable in the interim, but by pursuing this social action, we will bankroll you with subsidies. And that's the ESG score system. That is, if you do our environmental, our social, and our transparent corporate governance metrics, then we'll subsidize you. And so it's moving the business world away from shareholder accountability and towards socially conscious corporate action, which is basically fascism.
ESG just makes it because oil companies and mining companies don't score well on ESG,
No.
so they don't attract any investment, and then the oil price goes up, and everyone wonders why.
And that's why they're divesting into green stuff. This is the root of our, and it is basically an effort to sabotage working economic systems to moralize the market towards their ends. So it's the apparatus of the Great Reset. Yeah. And if you want more on that, you can read my article at lotususers.com. So where have we heard narratives about?
I was like not into all this Great Reset stuff. But like you might have converted me over the course of today's interview.
It's
every time
disturbing.
I talk about something, you've read the guiding text on it, and you're able to cite what the theory is.
Oh, well,
you know your stuff.
I feel like I'm, when a hunter wants to try and understand the movements of a lion, I desperately want to understand exactly what these sort of predatory villains from Mordor, essentially, think when they're trying to besiege our Shire. So I suppose we're both trying to define what one ring we're trying to throw into Mount Doom here. And I'm just like Gandalf sprinting to Gondor to find out exactly if we've got the ring on ourselves. I'm sort of shaking you and going, is it secret? Is it safe? Anyway, not to drag out this metaphor too long.
But as soon as you remove their ability to create money, the whole game changes.
Agreed, which is why they want to capture the money supply. But
Well,
unfortunately,
they've already got it.
Yeah. So where have we heard narratives about a class of useless eaters being a plague on the planet before, where we've got to control what they eat and stop themselves from breeding? Well, it's from Yuval Harari talking to the World Economic Forum, funnily enough. I'll read it out a little paragraph. In Davos, we hear so much about the enormous promises of technology, and these promises are certainly real, but technology might also disrupt human society and the very meaning of human life in numerous ways, ranging from the creation of global useless classes to the rise of data colonialism and digital dictatorships. Those who fall in the struggle against irrelevance would constitute a new useless class, people who are useless not from the viewpoint of their friends and family, but useless from the viewpoint of the economic and political system. This useless class will be separated by an ever-growing gap from the more powerful elite, which means biological knowledge combined by computing power multiplied by data equals the ability to hack humans. So he was talking about sort of transhumanism and how this could overcome the useless classes. We plant a chip into their brain and get them to do what we want. And this was an opening speech, by the way. This isn't like a caricature of a villain. The power to hack humans can be used for good purposes, like providing much better healthcare. But if this power falls into the hands of 21st century Joseph Stalin, the result will be the most totalitarian regime in human history. And we already have a number of applicants for the job of 21st century Stalin. I would argue they're all at the World Economic Forum, so that is a staggering amount of non-self-reflection there. But it's exactly as you said. They're not only trying to control the money supply, they're trying to control literally the thoughts in your head using a computer chip. And if you're one of the useless classes, well, then you're a drone. You'll eat bugs and you'll do what we tell you to.
Yeah, one of my ludicrously rich Bitcoin billionaire mates, who's a sort of Silicon Valley, one of those Silicon Valley dudes who's holed out in New Zealand somewhere. That kind of thing. And he's early on every trend and he's always right. And you'd like, how do you do it? He says to me that he thinks we're going into a world where we're going to be all in like a Club Med or a Butlins or a Centre Parks, one of those kind of resorts.
Yeah.
And we're all going to be in there on VR headsets. And that's where we're going.
Yeah, well, it's obviously renewably powered, isn't it? So
yeah.
It's literally the Matrix where you're in a pod and you're hooked up. So if you think that some of these policies might be worth doing to save the planet, worth pursuing, I'll just finish off with a little reading from this book, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, probably the most harrowing account of what happened in the Soviet Union. And he has
Konstantin was talking about this the other day.
If there is one book I recommend people to read, it's this. And we will cover it at some point in the podcast. It's just that no one else in the office can actually sit through and get through it because it's so depressing. And it is inspiring in just how awful totalitarianism was. And if you'd like a passage on why we cannot pursue these policies because they will result in starvation, I will read the following paragraph to you.
It's had more 5-star. Look at all those 5-star reviews. It's had 5,912 5-star reviews.
None of them came from Antifa, I can tell you now.
Not from Klaus Schwab.
No. Hunger rules every human being, unless he has himself consciously decided to die. The starving man grows weaker, and the bigger he is, the faster it goes. He grows deaf and stupid. He loses all capacity to weep, even when he is being dragged along the ground behind a sledge. He is no longer afraid of death. He is wrapped in a submissive, rosy glow. He has crossed all boundaries and has forgotten the name of his wife, of his children, and finally his own name too. Sometimes the entire body of a dying man of starvation is covered with blue-black pimples like peas, with pus-filled head smaller than a pinhead, his face, arms, legs, his trunk, even his scrotum. It is so painful he cannot be touched. The tiny boils come to a head and burst, and a thick worm-like string of pus is forced out of them. The man is rotting alive. We cannot afford to repeat the horrors of history. We cannot afford to pursue incompetent environmental policies at the expense of food security, and we cannot afford to allow these unelected, crazy people to control what we eat and treat us like useless classes worthy of extermination. To all the farmers that go out on their tractors and protest this nonsense, God bless you, and I hope for our sake you succeed. As we are strapped for time, we will cover the video comments, and I hope we still get time to do some, and I hope I haven't depressed you too much.
No, it's just interesting, this battle between people and those who would control has been going on through history. It's never stopped. I'm thinking of the savants in the French Revolution and the ordinary people, and this battle between, the technocrats, the metropolitan liberal elite, whatever word you want to use, and all the rest of us. It never stops going away. And what is it, this urge that people have to control everyone else?
Imperial utopianism. They believe they have the best rationalistic...
I knew you'd have the theory.
Well, they believe they have the best rationalistic framework to impose on the world. And so if you are disagreeing with this inevitable endpoint of humanity, like the communist resolution always arriving out of capitalism, then you're just an impediment to utopia. And so we can get rid of you for everyone's collective benefit. You're just in the way.
But my utopia is not necessarily your utopia, and that's the thing they never seem to grasp.
Yeah, but they believe that it is everyone's utopia, and that just by standing in the way of that, you're one of the bourgeois enemy class. So,
if you're anti-globalist, you're a fascist.
Well,
according to what I read on
fascists
Twitter
themselves
yesterday.
have the exact same governmental structure as that. So I reject that framing. They can go to hell.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the content we have on the site, such as this article, How Nations Fail, Sri Lanka's Affair with Green Ideology. You want to find out what else we're putting out, you can follow us on Getter at @lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.